and opening remarks today. So before joining ADBI last April, Dean Sonobe served as the Vice President of the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies here in Tokyo and taught economics for 30 years at the Tokyo Metropolitan University and GRIPS. He is a recipient of the Nikkei Book Publication Prize and the Masayoshi Ohida Memorial Prize, and a founding board member of the Japanese Association for Development Economics. His research interests are centered on the empirics of economic development, particularly the roles of industrial clusters, human capital, social capital, human management practices, the market, competition, industrial development, and in developing Asia and other regions. So Dean Sonobe, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Derek. Good day. Welcome, everyone. I'm very happy you've all joined us today to focus on the big solution rather than the big problem. I don't like to talk about the big problem. Oh, I'm sorry, I mentioned it mistakenly. Transitioning from a linear to circular economy makes sense, particularly for developing Asia. I commend the work and commitment of our distinguished guests toward realizing this transition. His Excellency Minister Chan Hon-hap, Government of Vietnam, Elina Kaluk, Government of Finland, Miranda Shinitoga, Ellen MacArthur Foundation, Ramesh Subramanian, Asian Development Bank, Janet Selan, UNSCAP, and Linda Arthur of ADBI. In addition, a warm welcome to the authors and discussants who will present important policy research and share their insights today. Some say that circular economy is not new, and they would be partially right. I'm happy to say that Japan, home to ADBI, was one of the earliest countries to enact national law on resource efficiency back in 2000. These early efforts were mainly geared toward efficient solid waste management. Although it's an important part of circular economy, it's far from the entire picture. What the discourse on circular economy has brought is a systemic version, a vision for change across diverse sectors, including agriculture, manufacturing, food, textiles, infrastructure, and tourism. I very much hope this conference will be the first of many events and knowledge products from ADBI on the circular economy. Let me also say that today's event is a side event to the landmark circular economy event of the year, the World Circular Economy Forum, which will be hosted by Canada from September 13 to 15. Let me close on the final note of thanks to our audience for taking the time to join us today. Please engage in the dialogue very actively by sending your questions and comments. With this, I wish you all a very successful and fruitful conference. Thank you very much. Derek, back to you.
Thank you very much, Dean Sonobe. Now let us move back to the keynote address. Today we are honored to have Miranda Schnitger, government lead from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, to give an overview of circular economy and its role in addressing global challenges while creating sustainable opportunities. This will set the tone for the rest of the presentations and discussion in today's event. So Miranda leads on engagement with national policymakers as part of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's institutions, governments, and cities team. This includes exploring the conditions they can set to enable, accelerate, and lead to the transition to a circular economy. She recently led the development of the Universal Circular Economy Policy Goals, a framework of 5 goals to support a common direction of travel in circular economy policy development. So Miranda, the floor is yours.
Hi, Derek. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation to join you. I'm very excited to be here for today's discussion. So I think my slides are just appearing. Yes. Okay, great. So I wanted to start by actually picking up on some of the comments we just heard in the introduction. So the circular economy, if we go to my first slide, is a much bigger idea than just recycling. It is a vision about how we can transform the economy and how we use and manage materials and products in a new way. It goes beyond doing less damage within our current system to rethinking how we design our economies to drive economic development, value creation, and is based on 3 core design principles that I've noted here on this slide. Design out waste and pollution, keep products and materials in use, and regenerate natural systems. These principles can inform how we design products, services, and systems to create a regenerative, restorative economy. And what I find really exciting about these principles is that they open up new ways of thinking and opportunities for how, not only how we design, also how we design and think about business models, how we look at collaboration and reverse logistic opportunities. And there's a whole range of actors that are involved in making this transition happen, which I will cover briefly in this keynote before we go into the detail with the panel. So to look at some of the opportunities, in 2015, one of our early sort of geographically focused studies was focused on Europe. And we found that when we modeled just for 3 sectors, so construction, food, and mobility, there could be an annual benefit yield of 1.8 trillion euros by 2030, double that if we stay in the current linear path. We then did subsequent testing of the idea with models for India and for China, and we found similar positive economic benefits with household and business savings, alongside emissions reductions and pollution also going down. To look at it from a jobs perspective, the OECD recently ran a study assessing multiple different studies and concluded that with the adoption of circular economy policies, there will be an average net positive employment gain. And to take this into sort of more granular imaginable space, if we think about plastic packaging and we apply circular economy to a sector like that, alongside reducing the amount of plastic that enters our oceans by up to 80%, it can again reduce the emissions by 25% and bring job creation opportunities and business savings. So the opportunities and the benefits from the circular economy transition are significant and broad. And I'll just touch on one more example from a recent World Health Organization study that looked at the benefits for direct and indirect health. And these were coming from the reduction in pollution, the improved natural system resilience, improvements in food safety and security, as well as reducing costs for the healthcare services. So at a time when we're also now trying to recover from a global pandemic, the circular economy offers a really attractive path forward. I just want to highlight on my next slide the connection between circular economy and the SDGs. So yes, circular economy is very often connected to SDG 12, where it has its natural home. It's a key part of how we're going to achieve sustainable consumption and production, because we're going to transform the system through applying these principles across sectors. But what I love about this research from the IRP is also that the benefits of the circular economy transition apply to at least 11 sustainable development goals. So I've already mentioned climate benefits, benefits to biodiversity, but also importantly, things like SDG 9, so the inclusive and sustainable industrialization that picks up on innovation and also the large infrastructure need, which is particularly strong in this region. So to dive in for a moment to the circular economy benefits to climate change, on my next slide. Clearly, this year is another important year. We have COP26 coming up in November, and we also have COP15 on biodiversity. Our recent study on the contribution that circular economy can make found that 45% of emissions come from the way we produce products and food. So these emissions in this part of the pie that you see here are not going to be able to be tackled through the renewable energy transition alone. And it's going to take a range of other solutions. And this is where the circular economy really comes in. Through the redesign of how we manage products, we can design out waste and pollution, we can reduce emissions. We can keep the embedded energy and the emissions that have already been made in use by keeping products in the system for longer. And also by switching to regenerative natural systems, we can sequester carbon. So there's a range of opportunities here of how circular economy contributes to the climate change challenge. Looking at how different actors have a role to play, we think business, government, and finance have a really important upstream role to play. This is because these three groups have a real say in determining what goes onto the market, and once things are on the market, how they are kept in use. So in circular economy language, one often sees the term upstream. Policymakers can inform upstream decisions through the regulations and incentives and disincentives that are put in the system. Businesses make upstream choices through how they produce, how they design, how they manufacture, and also how things are offered once they are on the market. Are they sold outright, or are they using other alternative options for getting the product to the customer and then potentially back through reverse logistics? And finance clearly has an important role to play in assessing the risk of the current system, assessing new business models, and bringing these opportunities to life through the financial support that they can give to new opportunities. And we've seen in the last 5 years a number of initiatives amongst these three actors growing, which is really encouraging. So to give a quick flavour of opportunities in three sectors that we are focused on: plastics, fashion, and food. So thinking about the three principles, if we think about how they apply to plastics, there's a role for eliminating plastic that we don't need. There is a role for innovating to ensure that what the plastic that we do use is reusable, recyclable, or compostable. And there is a role for the plastics that's on the market to be supported by systems and models and choices that keep the plastic packaging in the economy for longer and helping it to circulate. So there's eliminate, innovate, and circulate opportunities. And we've seen through reusable packaging that there's a 10 billion innovation opportunity, savings of up to 25%, job creation opportunities, and also savings to governments who are otherwise funding the current system, which is costly. Over 1,000 organizations that we work with have joined in signing a common vision for a circular economy in plastics, and they represent 20% of the plastics value chain, coming from different parts of the value chain. These organizations report annually on progress towards common targets that they've all agreed to by 2025. And they are also supported by initiatives that are local, so in plastics pacts that take place in countries or regions. The most recent one that launched was Australia, New Zealand, the Pacific Islands. So those are some of the initiatives that are taking place in plastics. In fashion, we think about the circular economy in terms of how can these items be used more, how can they be made to be made again, and how can they be made from safe and renewable or recycled inputs. A circular economy for fashion could address up to $500 billion of value that's currently lost due to clothing being underutilized, and also due to the ineffective collection and recycling infrastructure that we have today. But at the same time, there are really positive trends taking place. So clothing resale is expected to be the biggest part of fashion by 2029. And food, again, it's interesting to apply the principles to the different systems because, as was said in the introduction, different systems and sectors have different characteristics. So here in the space of food, we need to think about how do we design and market healthier food products. Design in the concept in the space of food can be an unusual thing to think about, but actually there are choices that are made in terms of how the ingredients that are used, the inputs that are used during the agricultural phase. How can we source regeneratively? And how can we make sure that the food that we use is sourced locally where appropriate? And then finally, there is, of course, a large element of byproduct in this sector. So how can we grow the bioeconomy and find innovations there? Each one of these three sectors is underpinned and supported by other sectors. Infrastructure, which is a really large growth area, particularly in this region, supports each one of these. So there's a really important role for applying circular economy principles to how infrastructure is designed, but also how infrastructure, where it is placed and the relationship of different elements to one another, how they then facilitate the exchange of products, the circulation, new business models existing. So industrial symbiosis is one of these examples where it's very careful thinking about businesses that are placed, co-located in order for byproducts from one to become input items for another business. In the finance space, I just wanted to very briefly highlight that over the last year, we've seen significant growth in the circular economy idea being taken up. There was a 14-fold increase last year in public equity funds that focused on circular economy. And at the same time, there's been a similar steep growth in the bond market, bank lending, project finance and insurance. Compared to the entire sector, this is still a new area, but these are all positive signs and supported by policy initiatives, such as work to improve standardization and reporting mechanisms. For example, the EU taxonomy work that's currently ongoing, Chinese supervisory scheme, for green bond verifiers, and further initiatives around the non-financial reporting. And now I just want to conclude on the role that government can play, because this is the area that I focus on the most. So over the last year, we've also seen a lot of new initiatives being launched in different regions. So in February this year, the Global Alliance for Circular Economy and Resource Efficiency was launched, which has countries joining it from every region of the world. This is a forum that's new and going to be a source of exchange of best practice. There's a real recognition currently that as the idea of circular economy gets picked up, which is incredibly positive, there is a need for alignment between different systems so that products can flow and trade opportunities can continue to exist, so that the infrastructure in one part of the world also supports the activity in another part of the world. And then by region, there are also initiatives taking place. Within Europe, there's circular economy as a core part of the European Green Deal. In Africa, there is a new alliance it's actually existed for a while, but it's being formalized and grown at the moment for the African Alliance on Circular Economy. Similarly, in Latin America, there is a new initiative to bring together the countries of that region and focus on developing a common vision for circular economy there, identifying which sectors are the key opportunity areas, which is similar to how the African Alliance is also going about it. And in this region of Asia and Oceania, we've seen an increase in circular economy being highlighted as part of SDG 12 plans, a focus on improving waste management. And there's a real opportunity here to go beyond the waste management as we know it, to moving on to thinking about resource management. How are these things kept in the system so that they can be used again? So with this in mind, and I touched already on the idea of alignment being really important, I want to conclude by sharing the framework that we launched recently, the Universal Circular Economy Policy Goals. This is really taking the three principles I mentioned at the beginning to eliminate waste and pollution, keep products and materials in use, and regenerate natural systems, and ground them in 5 areas where policymakers can really take the leadership role in incentivizing and creating a system where circular economy is now the norm, rather than an activity that is growing on the edges, but in fact the incentives within the system are still encouraging a linear cycle. So the first is to stimulate design for circular economy. And examples of policy measures that would support this are product policies, which is a build on earlier efforts, for example, around eco-design, which looked at the energy efficiency of products, to now moving on to thinking about how can policy support design decisions that means that products will be more durable, more repairable, remanufacturable. And each one of these decisions can then support local infrastructure that has the skills and opportunities to service that. If you think about the construction sector, it would be looking at construction policies that can support disassembly rather than demolition. Or in the agricultural space, it's thinking about how regenerative agriculture can be supported. And there's various policy measures and opportunities that inform that, including for all 3 of these policies around chemicals and input legislation. So making sure that what we put into the system in the first place is compatible with a system that then can support that staying in use. This is the upstream element. It is very much supported by the second goal, which looks at once everything is on the market, how do we keep those items in use? So extended producer responsibility is a key part of this, so are deposit return schemes. There are also opportunities to use tax incentives to stimulate more activity, for example, in the repair and remanufacturing sector. Another part of this is perhaps also including initiatives that would reduce the reliance on landfill and incineration currently. So looking at how is the resource management to keep things in use more accessible, where is the infrastructure for that in place? And are the alternatives becoming less attractive? this point about how those two goals work very well together. So you have the upstream and then the downstream supporting each other, forming a key loop. And within that, you have multiple different options. But what's really interesting about goal 3 is that it recognizes that there are wider incentives in the economy. And these often sit and are the domain of multiple ministries across government, but particularly economics ministries. So looking at what does subsidies back, and are they aligned with the circular economy principles? In the pandemic, we've seen several governments attach conditions to funding and support that has been given to the business sector. Are those conditions supporting a trajectory that will now take us to a new system, or are they simply reinforcing the linear economy, which we know is leading to multiple global challenges? Public procurement and making sure that that is aligned and creating the economies of scale is a really important lever for government. And so too various other initiatives that policy measures that need to be looked at to make sure that the wider economic incentives are there. And this can range from an assessment of labour market policies to a look at competition policies. And trade is a really important part as well. A lot of what I've said can be thought about in a national context, but actually the international context of how materials flow is really important to build into policy measures that reach across borders. So trade is a key one. The 4th goal is looking at investment, which will be unsurprising, but public sector and how it can also leverage more private sector investment is key. And it's important to highlight that actually this is in infrastructure, in innovation, and in skills. There is a transition in this model, and there is a need to harness things like digital innovation, but also recapturing more traditional innovations that have perhaps been lost along the way. How can those be supported, and how can government funds into research help these new ideas and opportunities come to scale? How can public funding work with the private sector to put the infrastructure in place? And how can public finance capabilities also work with education? Is circular economy included into the curriculum? Are there opportunities to keep training and learning the skills of a circular economy model? So to conclude all of these and supported by these 4 goals is the important point of collaboration, which I'm sure will come up many times today. But there is no one actor with their own actions that can actually make the transition happen alone. Policy sets the conditions, and through that creates a leadership role, but it can't do it alone, and so many sectors have their own intricacies. So a collaboration between the private and public sector is critical to this. It can also help identify where should the targets be placed. Can there be an alignment, for example, in international standards or international policies and regulations? And at the same time, can the targets reflect the local starting point and make sure that they are stretching and ambitious, but also matching of the initial start point? Data is a real part of developing a sense of our progress in this. And again, that's something where the private and public sector can collaborate. And ultimately, if there is inclusion in the development of policies, there will also be more ownership and more discoveries along the way, because the circular economy is about innovation. It's something that we together will create through design and through upstream thinking. So making sure that there is inclusion of multiple voices is really important to this. So to conclude, these 5 goals sit together as a framework. The policy measures that support them are multiple. Individual policy measures can support multiple different goals as well, because the system is interconnected. It's high level, but that's with the purpose of making sure that there is alignment and a drive in the same direction, but in full recognition that every country will start from its starting point with its priority sectors. So from that point of view, it's a framework of guidance, and then must be discussed and using local expertise to bring it to life. So I very much hope that in this discussion we will hear more of that local expertise, and these frameworks can be a guide, but that we can get more into the detail from here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Miranda. So next, may I ask that all panelists, presenters, and those on today's agenda, please turn on their cameras for a quick group photo. If you're not on the agenda, may I kindly ask that you keep your cameras off for the speakers. Thank you very much. Okay, just a minute. Okay, are we ready? 1, 2, 3. Ready? Again, 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. So now this brings us to the next part of on the agenda, the panel discussion. So from linear to circular, what will it take? So for this session, we have Janet Salem, an expert on circular economy from United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. So Janet has been working with the United Nations over the last 15 years with a focus on circular economy and sustainable consumption and production. Currently, she is with UN SCAP, managing projects on technology and circular economy, such as Closing the Loop project, which focuses on measuring, monitoring, and preventing plastic pollution. So Janet, the next 50 minutes are yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Derek. Greetings to everyone present. As Derek said, I'm Janet. I'm with you from the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, and I've been working on the topic of circular economy the last 15 years. So it's a real pleasure to be here and to be able to explore this topic with some amazing speakers in the panel. So let me start by introducing each of the speakers, and then I'm going to ask each of them 1 or 2 questions about their perspectives on circular economy. So allow me to start with His Excellency Tran Hong Ha, Minister of Natural Resources and Environment in Vietnam. So the Minister has been the Minister for Natural Resources and Environment in Vietnam since 2010. So over 11 years now, actually almost his anniversary. Previously, he served as the Director General of various agencies and administrations within the Vietnamese government, including the Environmental Protection Agency and the Environmental Administration. So very long history and career in the environment sector, and I'm looking forward to hearing His Excellency's perspective on the topic. After we talk to His Excellency, we will move to Undersecretary Kalku. So Alina Kalku is the Undersecretary of State at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Finland, and also the Governor for Finland of the Asian Development Bank. So prior to her current position, Undersecretary Kalku has served as Director General of the Department of the Americas and Asia at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. That's from 2005 to 2015, and before that, as Director of the Security Policy Unit at the Political Department of the Ministry. Mrs. Kalku joined the ministry in 1983, so again, a very long career in this area, and in those early years, she served abroad in the Finnish embassies in Europe and North America. Then we will move to Ramesh Subramaniam. He's the Director General of Southeast Asia Regional Department in the Asian Development Bank. Ramesh has been with the Asian Development Bank for 24 years. He's worked in different functions and areas over 25 countries. So he has lots of experience from a lot of different places across the various sub-regions of Asia and the Pacific. In his current capacity as Director General of the Southeast Asia Department, he's in charge of the ADB's relationship with the 10 countries in the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, and Timor-Leste, as well as all of its sovereign engagement. I'm very interested to hear about the experience, particularly in ASEAN. And last but not least, we have Linda Arthur, Senior Capacity Building and Training Specialist at the ADB Institute, more of the think tank perspective. So Linda works with government officials by designing knowledge products to strengthen policy making and implementation across a range of priority areas for both developing and emerging Asia, including the following topics: the use of strategic foresight for inclusive recovery policies, very topical right now, as well as innovation ecosystems to spur green growth, again, very relevant to circular economy. And one of my favorite topics, leveraging behavioral insights to augment development impact. So I'm very much looking forward to all of these perspectives. But let me come back to His Excellency Tran Hong Ha, Minister of Natural Resources and Environment in Vietnam. Now, my first question is about the motivation of countries to move towards circular economy. So we know that there are different motivations of different countries. So some different countries are motivated to reduce pollution within their country, and others are motivated to reduce the dependence on resource extraction, primary industries. Whereas others are interested for more economic or security reasons, such as economic growth potential. We heard about that from Miranda. There's a huge economic opportunity in the circular economy. There's also an opportunity for jobs. And lastly, what could be relevant, be interesting to talk to Mrs. Kalku about is reducing import dependence. So, Your Excellency, I'd like to understand what are the main motivations for Vietnam to shift to a circular economy?
Trước tiên tôi xin được chào buổi sáng, buổi trưa và buổi tối các quý vị lãnh đạo của Ngân hàng Châu Á cũng như là lãnh đạo của Bộ Ngoại giao Phần Lan cũng như là các vị diễn giả có mặt hôm nay. Tôi hết sức là thú vị được tham gia cái diễn đàn này, đề cập đến một cái vấn đề tôi nghĩ rằng là hết sức quan trọng, có tính thời sự, cấp bách, khẩn cấp và cũng là một trong những cái vấn đề mà hiện nay trên phạm vi toàn cầu, như chúng ta nói, đang trước thềm của cái hội nghị cấp khu vực Diễn đàn Kinh tế Tuần hoàn Thế giới tại Canada, hoặc là đang trước thềm của hội nghị về COP26 tại Vương quốc Anh về biến đổi khí hậu, hoặc là như chúng tôi ở đây đang rất bận rộn để chuẩn bị triển khai thực hiện cái thông điệp năm nay của Ngày Môi trường Thế giới, đó là thập kỷ phục hồi hệ sinh thái tự nhiên. Bản thân bà Janet Salem đã nêu lên 3 cái lý do, thì tôi đồng tình luôn, và có lẽ là cái nguyên nhân và động cơ để chúng tôi lựa chọn cái kinh tế tuần hoàn. Tôi coi kinh tế tuần hoàn đối với các nước có nền kinh tế cũng như là cái điều kiện phát triển đang phát triển như Việt Nam, cũng như là việc chuyển từ tiến tính sang tuần hoàn, thì đấy chính cũng là cái điều kiện của đất nước chúng tôi. Và cái việc lựa chọn này thì nó sẽ nhằm thứ nhất là bản thân cái nhu cầu phát triển hiện nay, thì cái tài nguyên thiên nhiên chúng ta là hữu hạn, mà thực tế biến đổi khí hậu khẩn cấp cũng như là cái sụp đổ và suy thoái các hệ sinh thái tự nhiên, rồi các nguồn nhiên liệu hóa thạch đang cạn kiệt, rồi các cái nguồn tài nguyên khác như là sắt thép, thì như một cái thống kê gần đây của Ngân hàng Thế giới, thì hành tinh chúng ta hay là nền kinh tế của thế giới chúng ta đã đạt đến mức tiêu thụ mà có thể nói phải 3 hành tinh, 3 cái nguồn lực tài nguyên như hành tinh chúng ta thì mới đáp ứng được cái cường độ và cái mức tiêu thụ như hiện nay. Thì cái đây là một vấn đề mà hết sức là quan trọng. Cái thứ hai là chúng ta thấy là hiện nay bản thân là chúng ta đang là cái nguyên nhân chính đã dựa trên một cái phương pháp tiếp cận không đúng đắn, và cũng đã có rất nhiều sai lầm đối với trong xử lý mối quan hệ tự nhiên. Và hầu hết các hoạt động kinh tế hiện nay có thể nói là nguyên nhân của 90% đa dạng sinh học bị mất đi do phát triển kinh tế. Rồi chúng ta sẽ thấy đến những vấn đề lớn của toàn cầu bên cạnh biến đổi khí hậu, thì vấn đề về đại dương cũng vậy. Cái lượng rác thải ra đại dương, vấn đề rác thải nhựa đại dương đã trở thành một vấn đề khẩn cấp toàn cầu, chúng ta đều biết. Và như vậy thì cái việc mà như đất nước chúng tôi trước sức ép của cái phát triển, trước sức ép của gia tăng dân số, và trước cái việc cần phải thay đổi cái phương thức mô hình phát triển kinh tế, thì kinh tế tuần hoàn là một chặng đường hết sức quan trọng khởi đầu trên con đường chúng ta tìm kiếm để đạt được mục tiêu của thiên niên kỷ, đó là phát triển bền vững. Trên con đường đó chúng tôi cũng coi kinh tế tuần hoàn là một trong những cái giải pháp quan trọng bên cạnh các giải pháp về kinh tế xanh, kinh tế carbon thấp. Và những giải pháp này, những con đường này đều dẫn dắt chúng ta đến cuối cùng, đó là phát triển bền vững. Và như các vị đã trình bày thì kinh tế tuần hoàn nó thực sự là khởi đầu cho một cái cách thức tiếp cận mới mà con người chúng ta có thể trên cơ sở là cái tài nguyên vật chất chúng ta đang có, chúng ta có thể sử dụng tiết kiệm một cách tiết kiệm, hiệu quả, và thông qua cái trí thức và cái thiết kế thông minh của mình thì chúng ta có thể tạo ra được những cái lĩnh vực ngành nghề mới thông qua cái việc kéo dài cái vòng đời của vật liệu, của tài nguyên. Và cái điều này nó sẽ mang lại những cái hiệu quả về mặt kinh tế, và đồng thời nó cũng chính là tạo ra những ngành nghề mới, và nó sẽ tạo ra cho những công ăn việc làm mới. Ở đây tôi cũng nhấn mạnh là trong cái khái niệm về kinh tế tuần hoàn có thể rộng hơn, là hiện nay chúng ta tiếp cận là 9A chẳng hạn. 9A thì ở đây trong cái 9A đó thì tôi cho rằng là ngoài ra chúng ta phải chú ý đến một cái điều nữa mà tại hội nghị P4G mà đã nhấn mạnh, đó là vấn đề tiếp cận một cái nguồn năng lượng tái tạo, năng lượng sạch. Nó thay cho cái nguồn năng lượng về hóa thạch hiện nay. Và đó là những lý do và động cơ, và tôi cho rằng là đây chính là cái mục tiêu để giúp cho Việt Nam có thể phát triển lâu dài bền vững, đạt được bền vững, và cũng chính là giúp cho Việt Nam đạt được các cái mục tiêu cam kết như là thỏa thuận Paris, hoặc là những các công ước về đa dạng sinh học, hoặc là những cái thỏa thuận liên quan đến vấn đề chống rác thải nhựa đại dương, vân vân. Và đây cũng chính là sự lựa chọn và con đường của các nước. Khi chúng ta nhận thức đúng thì tôi cho rằng đây là một mô hình phát triển rất là phù hợp trong cái điều kiện và bối cảnh hiện nay. Tôi xin được có một số ý kiến. Tôi cũng sẵn sàng sẽ lắng nghe cái trao đổi của các quý vị.
Thank you very much. You raised a number of important priorities when it comes to circular economy. I heard about jobs, I heard about new economic sectors, climate change, and reducing pollution, which brings me to my next question, which is about interministerial cooperation. Now, I'm curious, as Minister for Natural Resources and the Environment, which other ministries are critical for MONRE to engage with in order to achieve a circular economy? For example, you mentioned jobs. Is this the Ministry of Commerce engaged and interested? You also mentioned plastic. We know plastic waste is such an issue. Is the Ministry for Seas and Islands, or perhaps the Ministry for City that engages with cities and local governments important to you? Or perhaps it's the Ministry of Finance to unlock a few of those policy instruments like taxes and subsidies. So I'm curious, which are those ministries that you like to engage with on the topic of circular economy? Thank you.
Vâng, đây là câu hỏi rất hay. Nhưng mà cái điều quan trọng là phải có ai có bắt đầu một bước đi đầu tiên thì chúng ta mới có những bước đi tiếp theo. Nên việc khởi xướng này thì tại hội ở chúng tôi thì thiết chế là Đảng sẽ lãnh đạo về mặt chủ trương đường lối. Tại nghị quyết đại hội 13 của Đảng cũng đã xác định lựa chọn cái mô hình kinh tế tuần hoàn trong quá trình phát triển của mình, và cũng đã khẳng định là sẽ chuyển từ nền kinh tế tuyến tính, nền kinh tế sử dụng dựa vào khai thác tài nguyên, để chuyển sang nền kinh tế dựa trên thuận thiên, và trong đó đã lựa chọn kinh tế tuần hoàn. Thì cái điều này hết sức quan trọng, và hiện nay cái chủ trương có thể nói là mang tính chất bao trùm nhất quán, là được Đại hội Đảng lần thứ 13 Việt Nam xác định. cái việc mà hiện nay ấy, thì tôi cho rằng là Bộ Tài nguyên Môi trường chúng tôi sẽ là bộ mà giúp cho chính phủ sẽ đề xuất các cái phương pháp lộ trình để thực hiện. Và quan điểm chúng tôi là Bộ Tài nguyên Môi trường sẽ tập trung vào những lĩnh vực mà chúng tôi quản lý. Đó là gì? Đó là liên quan đến vấn đề quản lý chất thải rắn đô thị và nông thôn, tức là quản lý về mặt tái chế. Hai là chúng tôi sẽ đưa ra những chính sách để quản lý đối với các nhà sản xuất, các nhà nhập khẩu và người tiêu dùng, để đề ra những chính sách để các bên sẽ cùng với nhau thảo luận, để cùng xác định ra những cái công việc cần phải làm. Ở đây tôi muốn nhấn mạnh cái sự hợp tác. Như vậy là trong cái luật bảo vệ môi trường của chúng tôi ấy, thì chúng tôi đã đưa những cái quan điểm kinh tế tuần hoàn, và trong đó đặc biệt là đối với vấn đề tiếp cận xử lý chất thải rắn cũng như là xử lý về rác thải nhựa. Trong đó đã có những chính sách như một số như bà cũng đã nêu, và hoặc là như bà Marianne Nisser cũng đã nói ban đầu ấy, đề dẫn thì chính là cái việc là để xác định cái trách nhiệm mở rộng của các doanh nghiệp, các nhà nhập khẩu và người tiêu dùng. Và chúng tôi cũng đã thiết kế để làm sao nó đạt được cái nguyên tắc là 9A. Trong đó thì sẽ có sự tham gia từ nhà sản xuất, nhà xuất khẩu thương mại cho đến người tiêu dùng, thông qua việc đáp ứng là từ chối những sản phẩm mà chúng ta thấy là không thân thiện môi trường, chúng ta tiết giảm, tái phân phối, tái sử dụng, tu sửa tân trang, kéo dài vòng đời, tái sản xuất, thay đổi mục đích, tái chế, thu hồi năng lượng, tái khai thác, vân vân. Và đây là những cái việc mà chúng tôi đã thể chế nó hóa thành bằng luật. Và ở đây thì tôi cho rằng là cái quan trọng nhất khi để mà thiết kế và lựa chọn những tiêu chí để lựa chọn các cái dự án và lựa chọn cái định hướng phát triển kinh tế, thì Bộ cái đầu tư là bộ mà sẽ là bộ về kinh tế phát triển, sẽ phân bổ nguồn lực lựa chọn các dự án đầu tư trong nước và nước ngoài. Thì Bộ cái đầu tư sẽ cần phải đưa những tiêu chí này của chúng tôi trong quá trình mà đưa ra các quy hoạch về phát triển kinh tế xã hội, cũng như đưa ra những tiêu chí để lựa chọn các dự án kinh tế. Và những vấn đề chúng tôi nói ở đây nó những khía cạnh như là về thị trường, về tín dụng xanh, về thuế, phí, tức là những cái công cụ kinh tế để có thể khuyến khích hoặc là mang tính chất là điều tiết các cái việc mà cần hạn chế. Thì đương nhiên là chúng tôi cần có sự tham gia của Bộ Tài chính. Bộ Tài chính sẽ là bộ sẽ dựa trên những chính sách chúng tôi, những khung chính sách và dựa trên những cái tính toán của chúng tôi thì sẽ xem xét để có những cái công cụ kinh tế, chính sách thuế, phí để điều tiết cái việc này, hoặc là thành lập các quỹ, hoặc là ngân hàng thế giới, ngân hàng nhà nước, hoặc là chúng tôi cũng đề nghị một số cái thiết chế đa phương tài chính cũng đưa ra những tiêu chí đó để làm sao giúp cho những cái tiêu chí này nó được tính toán từ cái khi quy hoạch, từ cái khâu thiết kế design các khu công nghiệp cho các ngành phát triển, để rồi chúng ta trên một góc độ chung quốc gia thì chúng ta có một cái nhìn giữa sự liên kết phối hợp giữa các ngành. Và trong nền kinh tế bản chất của từng cái dự án thì có sự tính toán đến dựa trên cái nguyên tắc của chúng tôi đã nói là 9A. Thực tế hiện nay có 3 nhưng hiện nay phát triển đến 9A thì phát triển như vậy. Và đồng thời thì có nhiều chính sách và chúng tôi cũng cần phải dựa trên những cơ quan truyền thông, bởi vì đây là cái nhận thức và cái người trung tâm để quyết định thành công hay là thất bại chính là người tiêu dùng, chính là người dân. Thì chính vì vậy nên tôi muốn nhấn mạnh là chúng ta cần phải có chủ trương, chúng ta cần phải thể chế hóa, và chúng ta cần có phải phân định các cơ quan để tổ chức thực hiện. Và cái việc thực hiện đó chúng ta cần phải dựa trên chiến lược, trên quy hoạch, và thực hiện đó chúng ta dựa trên tiêu chí, tiêu chuẩn. Và cái việc thực hiện này tôi muốn nhấn mạnh rằng là nó không chỉ có các cơ quan trung ương mà chính là cộng đồng các địa phương là cũng hết sức quan trọng. Và tôi cũng muốn nhấn mạnh là nếu người dân nhận thức đúng thì mới thành công, Và trên thực tế thì không chỉ là những lĩnh vực hoạt động sản xuất công nghiệp lớn mà chúng ta mới làm về vấn đề tuần hoàn, mà trên thực tế trong xã hội, trong sản xuất nhỏ, trong kinh doanh nhỏ thì chúng ta cũng hoàn toàn tiếp cận được các nguyên tắc này. Đặc biệt là trong các lĩnh vực nông nghiệp vân vân thì chúng ta hoàn toàn có thể tiếp cận và hết sức hiệu quả. Và đây chính là dựa vào những cái tri thức bản địa tự nhiên, chúng ta cũng đã có những cái kiến thức này. Thì tôi xin cung cấp một số vấn đề mà ở Việt Nam chúng tôi đang tiếp cận và làm như vậy.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. You've mentioned a wide range of other ministries and priorities that would have to come in. You've mentioned multilateral banks, so Ramesh, I'll be coming back to you on that question. You also mentioned consumers and behaviour. Linda will come to you with that question later. So for now, I'd like to thank you very much for your insights, and we'll come back to you in the Q&A if there are questions further. Thank you very much, Your Excellency. So now I have the
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So now I have the pleasure of posing some questions to Undersecretary Kalku in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Finland. Now, we mentioned a lot of different ministries, but we didn't yet mention the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. However, a circular economy depends on supply chain coordination, and our supply chains are very globalized, crossing many borders. So I'm curious from your experience, can you give some insight into how international relations or foreign policy can facilitate circular economy, or even if it has gone in the way of circular economy? For example, when it comes to harmonizing standards or facilitating data sharing across supply chains, or even minimum requirements for imports. But you might have other ideas as well. I welcome your perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janet, and an interesting discussion indeed. And we're discussing a very international issue here. Even the Ministries of Foreign Affairs will need to focus on these issues. Of course, the topic is relatively new. We're talking about a paradigm shift. We're talking about a systemic change, definitely. Lots of trade policy issues, regulatory market measures are involved here. And I would use an example of the European Union in terms of regional action here. I think the awareness of member states, the awareness of the institutions are pushed by awareness by consumers to turn more green. And the European Union has indeed adopted a EU Green Deal. It was published last year, and it shows how serious the member states and the Union are about greening the economy further. And this is about planning together internationally, regionally, long-term society-wide growth strategy about shifting how our economies work towards more circularity. Within the EU, we published a first circular economy action plan, actually a very concrete document, contains measures to help stimulate Europe's transition towards the circular economy, boost competitiveness, of course, foster sustainable growth, economic growth, create new jobs, create actually new green jobs also. And the action plan simply established some concrete actions that cover the whole life cycle from production and consumption to waste management and to the market for secondary raw materials. And I believe Miranda already mentioned the other global alliances. There's a global alliance for circular economy and resource efficiency. There's other regional alliances, also in Africa, many African countries.
Oh, Ms. Kalku, I believe you've been muted, or you have muted yourself. I'm not sure. Apologies for the interruption.
I believe I have been muted by someone because I didn't touch the touch the machinery, so please keep my micro open. Thank you very much. So I think when we're talking about very long value chains, very complicated value chains, we need to look at the importance of secondary raw materials as a key element and a key for success as well. I mean, in an ideal world, I believe we would have universal rules of production, including for material content and recyclability of each good in the economies. And I would like to ask, why not think big here? Circular economy could be created by harmonizing standards globally. Standardization would enable better recyclability of end-of-value chain materials. It would remain actually at the same time many barriers to trade. So it would be good for economies and it would be good for sustainability. Very good example, the plastics, one of the most problematic waste materials that pollute oceans, that penetrate ecosystems and penetrate all life with microparticles. And of course, there's many measures taken to prohibit transportation of plastics or use of plastic bags and so on and so forth. But this is also a material that can be recyclable, and it often is. So I believe good standards are key here. International standards for plastic types could help design and manufacture products that would become recyclable anywhere in the world. We could close the circle, be more sustainable. We could facilitate trade and create green jobs at the same time. And also, I think Miranda mentioned how energy efficiency plays into this. I mean, with many resource-intensive industries, not only with plastics, but steel, cement, aluminium, we could actually reduce emissions from these industries by over half by 2050 if we tackle this. Right to repair rules would help, certainly boost service businesses, create more jobs in services, and so on and so forth. So we could do a lot across borders, internationally with trade policies, and combining the domestic measures with them. I think this is a very international issue because of the international value chains.
Thank you very much. I think these are important points about the harmonization of standards, which gives a nice, consistent message to the private sector of how to produce the right products and the different business models, so that it's not a very fractured market, but they can have one harmonized market where they can put more circular products and services out. I really appreciate that you mentioned the right to repair policy. I believe there are also product lifespan declarations under discussions, which helps consumers to know where it's worth spending a little bit of extra money for a recyclable or repairable product or a long-lasting product. I wonder if you have any advice for the ASEAN region at the earliest stages of moving towards a circular economy, or how to leverage regional integration in their journey, as we see a lot of national strategies. What particular early stages would help from a regional perspective?
Well, thank you for a very good question. And I think the Europeans and ASEAN have often compared notes between themselves on our experiences, and in the EU it works in a way that we have a regional roadmap, and then member states create national roadmaps to strengthen the circular transition. This is for each country a good way to explore the most suitable way for them towards circularity. The idea actually for national roadmaps, I think it stems from my country, because the Finnish Innovation Fund, Sitra, has done some really hard work on this for years and years, long term, actually. And together with Sitra, our industries have created low carbon roadmaps to support our ambitious goal, very ambitious goal, actually, to become carbon neutral by 2035. And this approach of national roadmap in circular economy is an important part of this. I think the humble advice for our ASEAN friends would be just to create and commit to a shared strategy, a regional strategy first, and then align national strategies and sub-strategies with the shared one to boost regional trade at the same time. I think it's also important that businesses innovate and can have realistic opportunities. This is also about green economy. Overlapping or too complicated rules should be avoided, I believe, both domestically and internationally. And I think advancing international development of shared rules is also a key. After all, this is not a local issue, only we all in this together.
Thank you very much for the insights. And very inspiring to see the progress in Finland and in the EU. So thank you very much. Okay, so I'd now like to turn to Ramesh Subramaniam from the ADBI, who is also charged with working with the ASEAN's member states. So I'd like to touch on the first question that was raised by His Excellency, the Minister from Vietnam. Where is the money? We keep hearing that the circular economy is $1 trillion opportunity. So my question to you is, where do we need to invest now to get the highest return?
Thank you so much, Janet. The Minister, Miranda, as well as Ms. Kalku have given fantastic perspectives. In fact, I also like what you have on the screen behind you in terms of particularly, the measure, monitor, prevent type of idea. Greatly appreciate this opportunity. A couple of points before I go to the Minister's question. If you take a macro look, kind of zoom out and take a macro look, the pandemic has had a devastating impact, as we all know. Economic losses in the Asia and Pacific region, they've been estimated up to $2.5 trillion. So that's massive. 67 million jobs lost. And this, by the way, the 2.5 trillion accounts for about 30% of the total global output drop. Now, in that context, we can also, as Sonabe-san was saying at the beginning, translate these problems or issues into opportunities. And now is the time basically to translate those problems into opportunities. While the pandemic has obviously been horrible, it also presents us with opportunities to, probably a lot more opportunities to go more circular. Let me just highlight a few points. The Minister's 9R framework is very comprehensive, and what Miranda covered, what Ms. Kalku talked about, all of them have got fantastic elements. If you look at, for example, the 9R framework, there are interconnected elements. If we look at sectors such as regenerative agriculture opportunities, healthy and productive oceans, there is an agenda that is emerging in ASEAN, which is actually, we are very happy to work with many countries. Sustainable urban development is certainly a pathway. And there are core consumer-driven circular economy models that Miranda talked about, significant opportunities there, as well as finally clean energy or energy transition that many speakers mentioned. So in all of these, there are significant opportunities. Now, where is the money? There is, in fact, plenty of money, in fact, out there. Now, with the pandemic, clearly, the fiscal space of public sector is certainly going to be constrained. Clearly, many countries are going on fiscal discipline. When it comes to fiscal consolidation, it's not a matter of if, it's going to be a matter of when. Now that poses certainly provides opportunities for the private sector, but private sector is not going to come in unless the risks that are out there that are mitigated. What Ms. Kolku mentioned in terms of upstream reforms that we need to put in place and things like harmonization of standards and practices, a lot of other enabling environment type of reforms that we need to put in place. Now, in this context, what are we doing at the ADB? I would say three things. One is ideas, second is skills, and third is money. When we look at new ideas, well, there are lots of new ideas. If you take, for instance, in the context of circular economy, again, kind of zooming out, if you look at fourth industrial revolution, the concept that was introduced, not too long ago, what are the pathways in terms of looking at changes that can be made in different sectors, whether it's consumer-oriented sectors or utilities and infrastructure sectors. So that's one, that mapping that we've been doing in ASEAN, working with many countries, particularly Indonesia, Vietnam, and the Philippines and Thailand. These are the four countries. Second is in terms of looking at skills, you have certainly the system of education and things like on-the-job training. The entire learning ecosystem needs to change. And third is money. With regard to money, what we have done is, well, immediately related to the pandemic, ADB support is $20 billion in helping with economic recovery, not counting the vaccine support. But in terms of moving ahead, we believe there are plenty of green recovery opportunities, and particularly for the public and private sectors to work together. We have set up an innovation hub in Southeast Asia Department, working with the ASEAN countries in ADB. Ocean finance is a key part of this. ADB itself, with regard to energy, clean energy, climate change, particularly at a broader level, we have an institutional commitment of at least $6 billion per year. As part of that, we are looking at a number of projects, and we have set up an ASEAN catalytic green finance facility, through which we have now mobilized over $2 billion of funding, including about $300 million that have come from the Green Climate Fund, with a significant portion of that going in as technical assistance. Now, I said that private sector is not going to come, although plenty of money is there. There is a challenge in terms of how do you translate all these big needs into bankable opportunities. That is where the challenge lies, and that's what we are focusing on, Janet. Let me pause there.
Okay, so you've said that the money is there. There's plenty of money, I heard, but the framework needs to be right. The system needs to be conducive to that kind of investment, particularly mitigating some risks and having maybe a consistent policy framework. Some of the topics that Undersecretary Kalku mentioned earlier. So let me perhaps take this forward to Linda, as I see we're a bit pressed in time. I may come back to you, Ramesh, on more specific questions about the money if we have time, but I'd like to thank you for your perspectives in the meantime. So Linda, over to you from your perspective of a think tank that's aiming to achieve this inclusive and sustainable growth in Asia, leverage that plenty of money that's out there. I'm wondering how a government can design the policy to really grasp those opportunities presented by the circular economy. As we heard from His Excellency, the Minister for Natural Resource and Environment, this is a topic that involves multiple ministries and multiple priorities. That can be very complex to design the right kinds of policies. So perhaps you could share your perspectives on this matter.
Thanks, Janet. And everyone's been so comprehensive. I think there's very little left to say, but let me just try to add a few things here. And let me frame my response in terms of maybe what it will take to motivate policymakers in countries that have not yet embraced a transition from linear to circular, and in countries like Vietnam, what it would take to implement those policies. So, just as an investor needs to see an opportunity to invest, I think it's the same with policymakers. They need to see that circular economy presents an opportunity that will, pay dividends in future. And to illustrate, let me use the infrastructure sector. We know that the infrastructure needs of developing Asia are massive. We may recall that in 2016, ADB released its estimates for the financing costs of critical infrastructure in developing Asia from 2016 to 2030. And that was approximately $26.2 trillion for the period, almost 3 trillion of which for climate mitigation and adaptation. But I would argue that, 5 years later, the discourse in circular economy and the SDGs related to resource utilization have really gained pace. And so I think it's clear, and I would argue that circular economy represents an opportunity to offset not just the cost of infrastructure, but also its carbon footprint. So how? And linking back to what Miranda already said, circular economy wants to leverage innovation in design to principally achieve, two things. A, it wants to ensure longevity for infrastructure so that, after 10 years, infrastructure is not demolished and thrown on the scrap heaps, that the life of infrastructure should be, 50 years plus, right? And then B, it wants to ensure that the end use of infrastructure is kept in mind when designing. So if the end use is kept in mind, then that would mean that it's easier to sort of dismantle end life, and the components and materials in infrastructure could then be repurposed, reused, remanufactured more readily. So by keeping materials in the system for longer, I think that really gives an opportunity to achieve, a reduction in resources. And I should say also that the two biggest, probably the two most important materials in infrastructure, steel and cement, are also two of the biggest contributors to global CO2 emissions, ranging respectively 7% for steel and 8% for cement. So if you reduce the usage of those and other materials, you can lower carbon emissions. So getting back to this opportunity, I think it's twofold: cost and CO2 emissions, offsetting both. And I think that this really presents a path and a fundamental opportunity to decouple economic growth from intensive resource use and environmental degradation. This should be sufficiently aspirational for policymakers to rally around and to motivate policymakers and to motivate implementation of circular economy policies.
I really appreciate what you said about designing the infrastructure for a circular economy, because now, having been based in Bangkok the last 8 years, I'm wondering, when we move to shared mobility and we no longer need so much parking spaces in our buildings, how can we use that bottom third of all our buildings in Bangkok for something else other than parking, for instance? So that I do agree with you on that. Okay, I have now received some questions in the chat, which I'd like to take and start passing through to our panelists. Starting with Ramesh, back to the money. Where's the money? So the question is, there's different pots of money for different needs when it comes to that transition to the circular economy. And the specific question that we've got is, what about for entrepreneurs who have a new business idea that maybe, and I'm now adding to the question, may not be easy to invest in by typical sources of finance, maybe a little bit more risky, more of a moonshot approach, but could be a game changer for circular economy. Where can they go for money? My other question is for SMEs that are employing a lot of our Asian citizens, is what about a small SME? They can't sort of jump through all that red tape to get to money, but they can make some changes towards a circular economy. What about these two groups? Where can they find some money?
Thanks, Janet. In terms of early stage startup, I'll just look first narrowly at ADB perspective. We have established recently a new initiative called ADB Ventures, which could be providing support for early stage startups, and that's the idea. In fact, for business ideas that are there that are being tested elsewhere, or there is a very strong business case to be made, ADB Ventures can support. And there are many others out there of that nature. In ADB's case, we will bring scale. We will also work with a number of partners outside in terms of mobilizing, leveraging private capital coming in. Now, having said that, with regard to particularly circular economy, there are tested models that are quite prevalent elsewhere in the world. In the Asia and Pacific region, particularly if you're looking at countries in Southeast Asia, they have not yet been tested. So there needs to be support provided. So what we are doing is to work with countries in terms of creating that system and providing funding to them. For example, in some countries, Cambodia, we've been talking to them about through an SME fund in terms of supporting the startup, creating a startup ecosystem. Now, so that's partly to the second question on SMEs. You also need, in order to the so-called red tape, we need to work with the banking sector in terms of looking at the lending practices. Obviously, they will be looking at the risks involved. So what do SMEs need in terms of particularly small enterprises? Medium enterprises may have more capacity. But for small enterprises which are willing to change their system and go into circular economy type of production models, they need to establish the proof of concept. And we need to develop a business case. So we've been providing technical assistance in many countries, and also working with the banking sector in terms of changing their risk management practices, because there is a change in the mindset that is needed, which, for example, in Europe and North America probably has been achieved, but not been achieved so far in developing Asia. In terms of resources, if you look at, again, ADB Ventures, I mentioned as a specific case, ADB does about $3 billion, $3 to $3.5 billion in terms of private sector funding every year. That is ADB's own funds. And then we add another about probably $7 billion in terms of co-financing. Out of the 10 billion, about 7 billion or so tends to go for large-scale infrastructure type of projects. But the remaining 3 billion could be potentially for a number of small and medium-sized enterprises, and also in sectors that have been frontier so far. And we are looking at circular economy type of models to look for opportunities and to finance them. We do need scale, but we also need to help these entrepreneurs address the risks involved, Janet. I'll pause there.
Thank you very much. So there are pots of money, perhaps in national innovation funds that can work with smaller business ideas, or perhaps SME funds as well. This sounds like a great idea. I have two more questions. We have a few more minutes. So one is about consumer behavior, and one is the logic of the circular economy. I'll start with the second one first, and if I could please ask Under Secretary Kalku, because in Europe and in Finland, you're a bit more advanced with circular economy. So my question is, from the audience is, if the logic of the circular economy is so compelling, why aren't companies doing it already? So I'd like to ask you, from the perspective of a country where companies weren't doing it, but now they are, do you have any insights into what was holding them back to begin with and what brought them to the table?
Well, a very relevant question, I think, and change always requires a motivation and some efforts. Usually we human beings, we continue doing the same thing as we did before, if we can choose. I think one element has been consumer awareness, definitely. Consumers have become much more aware of sustainability, about conservation of nature, about climate change, energy issues, and simply they redirect their behavior, their consumption, and prefer products that are sustainable. And this is a gradual change. It didn't happen overnight with those companies that have already turned much more sustainable. It takes some time. There's also been international awareness that is pushing all of us into right direction with the United Nations Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. So it takes some time, but I think one element for small and medium-sized enterprises is also that what we're talking about here will be economically viable over time. Simply creation of a stronger service sector will help to create jobs in SMEs. And certainly with information, with startup funding, and with definitely SME support funding, I think the change can be made. It will take some time. This is not happening overnight, but I think we need to be patient. And Finland, together with the ADBI, actually set up a fund supporting startups in clean energy and sustainable sectors, and it is also supported by the Nordic Development Fund. This is the kind of mechanisms we need. This will take some time, but I'm quite convinced it will happen, even if it didn't happen in the past years yet.
Yeah, actually, maybe one follow-up is the role of public procurement. And I'm wondering if governments can take the lead. You mentioned that these circular economy businesses need to have a market in which to sell. Perhaps government procurement could get the ball rolling. Have you seen any public procurement policy on innovation or circular economy that can bring these businesses that initial market?
Oh, absolutely. Governments need to take the responsibility, and many are taking the responsibility. But public procurement is an important element, absolutely. And there's also, I wanted to mention the taxonomy rules in the EU, which was adopted as an approach in April this year, directing financing towards sustainable objectives, making sure that standards are there, reporting is there. The aim is to avoid so-called greenwashing, making sure that actually investments go to right sustainable direction also.
Thank you very much. Yes. I'd like to just ask Linda to provide some final reflections on innovation and how important is it really to circular economy? Are there low-hanging fruits that we can go for, or do we really need to focus on leveraging innovation? If you could briefly give us a few reflections before we close. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Janet. I think the importance of innovation for circular economy cannot be overstated. And in the context of developing Asia, there's a huge gap between what developing economies, developing countries spend on R&D and what developed countries spend. So for example, South Korea would spend in the neighborhood of 3 to 4% of GDP on R&D. And meanwhile, developing economies spend very negligible amounts, perhaps 0.1 to 0.2% of GDP on R&D. So there's a massive gap. And to be clear, the innovation, the type of innovation that we need to see from emerging economies, it's not going to be that, how can I say, a global game changer type of innovation. It can be, more incremental, can be, adapting innovation. But there's still a lot of room there to achieve, growth on the back of those types of innovations. But it will still require investments from the government, and it will require government in a coordinating role. So, but one big opportunity here for circular economy, and again, in infrastructure as an example, with the proper investment, I think that, developing economies can actually leapfrog. We hear that term a lot, but it's a great example in the infrastructure sector, because finally, developing countries may be at an advantage vis-a-vis their developed counterparts. And what do I mean by leapfrog? 65% of the building stock required in OECD countries to 2060 is already in place. But for emerging economies, developing countries, we're talking mainly about new infrastructure, right? So there's a real opportunity now to, grasp those opportunities and ensure that design, as I mentioned before, captures the opportunity to offset both the cost of innovation and the carbon footprint in the future. But as I say, it's not going to happen in the absence of government action. Government has to be there with financing, and it has to be there in a coordinating role. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Linda. And I agree, there's so much infrastructure left to build in our region. It's an exciting area to channel some of these circular economy policy goals so that we can see it happen for our region. So there's been a lot of food for thought. I'd like to thank all the participants for their questions. We'll come back to you on a few of those in the chat, but for now I'd like to thank the honourable panelists for their valuable insights from government, from think tank, from the multilateral bank, and of course thank Miranda for providing that inspiration from the very beginning. So thank you very much, and back to you, Derek.
Thank you very much, Janet. His Excellency Minister Tran Hong Hua, Undersecretary Kalku, Director General Subramanian, and Linda for your engaging discussion. So because we're a bit behind on schedule, we're going to skip the break and we're going to move directly into the paper presentations. So in the following session, we'll be having two papers presented concurrently. Track 1 on governing transition to a circular economy, and track 2 on investing in a circular economy. So we will split into 2 breakout rooms, and you will have the option to select which one you would like to hear. So paper 1 in track 1 is titled Regulatory and Legal Framework for Plastics Extended Producer Responsibility. And paper 2 in track 2 is Business, Enterprise, and Investment Cases in Circular Economy. Okay. So at this time, we will be opening the breakout rooms. And again, please select which one you would like to go to.